To the people who actually matter, and not the ones who just sit around being useless. My brother Thomas said, lifting his glass with a smirk that spread slowly across his face as if he'd been waiting all evening to say those words. And the worst part wasn't even the insult itself but the way the table responded, the soft chuckles, the quick glances, the silence that followed, like everyone had silently agreed that what he said wasn't entirely wrong. And I just sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my expression calm, my lips curved into the faintest smile, because I had learned a long time ago that reacting too soon only gave people exactly what they wanted. And that night, Thanksgiving night, in my own son's house, surrounded by family who used to look at me with warmth and now looked at me like I was something inconvenient, I chose silence, and that was their first mistake. I'm Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and I've spent most of my life being the kind of woman who made things work quietly behind the scenes, the kind who cooked the meals, remembered the birthdays, paid attention to the details no one else noticed, the kind who built a life piece by piece alongside a man who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. And after my husband passed 3 years ago, everything shifted in ways I didn't fully understand at first, subtle at the beginning, almost invisible. Like a draft in a house you've lived in for decades but suddenly can't ignore. My son Daniel stopped calling as often, his visits became shorter, more scheduled, more managed, and Rebecca, my daughter-in-law, well, she had always been polite on the surface, perfectly dressed, perfectly spoken, the kind of woman who never raised her voice but somehow always controlled the room, and over time, I noticed how conversations would stop when I entered, how decisions were made without me. How I was slowly being repositioned from someone essential to someone optional, and by the time that Thanksgiving arrived, the shift was no longer subtle, it was structured, deliberate, and sitting at that long dining table, surrounded by plates of turkey and stuffing and cranberry sauce that I had once been the one to prepare, I could feel it clearly. I was no longer part of the center, I was an accessory to it. Thomas leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention, his voice louder now, confident. I mean, come on, Daniel's the one running things now, building the business, expanding, making real money, not like before, he said, glancing at me briefly, just enough to make sure I understood the implication, and Rebecca added softly, almost like she was smoothing things over but actually sharpening them. Everyone has their role, Thomas, she said, her smile polite but her eyes calculating. Some people contribute more than others. And Daniel, my own son, sat there between them, not laughing, not defending me, just existing in that space like neutrality was somehow acceptable, like silence didn't have weight, like it didn't say something just as loud as words. I reached for my glass of water, steady, controlled, because control was something I still had, even if they didn't realize it, and as I took a sip, I let my eyes move across the table slowly, observing, really observing, the way Rebecca's hand rested lightly on Daniel's arm, guiding, the way Thomas leaned forward whenever money was mentioned, the way certain topics were introduced and others avoided. And in that moment, something settled inside me, not anger, not even sadness, but clarity. The kind that comes quietly after years of not wanting to see something that's been right in front of you, because this wasn't just about a rude comment at dinner, this was about a pattern, a structure, a carefully built narrative where I had been assigned a role without my consent, the harmless widow, the dependent mother, the one who should be grateful just to be included. And as the conversation moved on, as plates were passed and laughter returned in small, controlled bursts, I sat there and let them continue. Let them believe their version of reality, because the truth is, I already knew something they didn't, something I hadn't needed to say out loud, not yet. And as Thomas raised his glass again, launching into another story about real work and real value, I simply smiled, the same calm, measured smile, because I had learned that the most powerful moments don't come from speaking first, they come from knowing exactly when to speak. And that night, I wasn't ready to speak just yet. I was still watching, still listening, still letting them show me exactly who they had become, and more importantly, exactly what they thought of me. And by the time the night was over, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They believed I was useless, and that belief was about to cost Them everything I stayed until the plates were cleared, until the last slice of pie had been served, and until the conversation drifted into smaller, quieter circles that did not include me, because leaving too early would have looked like weakness and staying too long would have made them uncomfortable, and I was not interested in giving them either, so I chose the middle, the place where I could observe without being noticed. And as I rose from my chair, I thanked Rebecca for the dinner even though I knew she had ordered most of it from a catering service, and she smiled that same polished smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes, and said, "Of course, Margaret, we wanted everything to be perfect." And I nodded because perfection was exactly what she curated, appearances that looked flawless from the outside while quietly rearranging everything underneath, and Daniel walked me to the door, his hand lightly touching my elbow as if guiding me, but it felt more like steering. Like I was something fragile that needed direction, and he said, "Mom, do you want me to call you a ride?" And I smiled at him, the same calm smile, and said, "No, Daniel, I drove myself." And for a brief second, something flickered in his expression, something uncertain, like he had forgotten that I was still capable of doing things on my own, and that small moment told me more than anything else had all evening. I stepped out into the cool night air, the kind that settles in after a long day. And I took a slow breath before walking to my car, a modest sedan that had been paid off years ago, the same car I had driven to countless family gatherings, school events, grocery runs, and quiet mornings when life was still simple. And as I sat behind the wheel, I did not start the engine right away. I just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the silence settle around me, because silence has a way of clarifying things when you let it. And what I realized in that moment was not new, it was something that had been building for years, piece by piece. Small changes that I had dismissed as coincidence or adjustment, but now they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I had been slowly removed from the center of my own life, not through confrontation but through omission, not through arguments but through quiet decisions made without me. And I thought back to the past year, to the times Daniel had mentioned the company, always in passing, always vague. "We are expanding," he would say, or, "Rebecca has been helping with operations." And I would nod, proud of him, proud that he had built something meaningful, something stable, something that carried his father's legacy forward. But now, sitting there in the dark, I began to replay those conversations differently. I remembered the one time I had asked a simple question about the business structure, just out of curiosity, and how quickly Rebecca had stepped in to redirect the conversation, her tone light but firm. "Oh, it is all handled, Margaret. You do not need to worry about those details." And at the time, I had accepted that, because worrying had never been my style. But now that sentence echoed differently. "You do not need to worry, or perhaps, you are not supposed to know." I started the car then, the engine humming softly, and as I drove home through quiet suburban streets lined with houses that all looked similar under the glow of streetlights, I let my thoughts settle into something more focused, less emotional, more deliberate, because reacting emotionally would not change anything, but understanding would. And by the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I needed clarity, not assumptions, not feelings, but facts, the kind that cannot be dismissed or explained away, the kind that exists on paper, in records, in structures that people rely on. When words are no longer enough, I walked into my house, a smaller place than the one Daniel grew up in but one that still felt entirely mine, and I turned on the light in the living room, the soft glow revealing familiar furniture, photographs, and small details that had remained unchanged, and I moved slowly, deliberately, toward the desk in the corner, the one I had not opened in months. Because it held things I had not needed to revisit, documents, letters, and files that belonged to a time when my husband was still here, when decisions were shared and responsibilities were clear. And as I sat down and opened the drawer, I felt that same quiet clarity settle over me again, because whatever had changed in my family, whatever roles they believed I now occupied, there was one thing they had forgotten, one thing they had underestimated, and that was the fact that I had been there from the beginning. Long before expansions and titles and polished conversations, long before anyone started deciding who contributed and who did not. And as I pulled out the first folder and placed it on the desk in front of me, I realized that this was not about proving them wrong, it was about understanding exactly what they thought they had taken from me, and whether they had ever truly taken it at all. I opened the folder slowly, not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because I wanted to remember exactly how everything began, because memory has a way of shifting when people start rewriting history, and I was not going to let that happen to me. Inside were documents I had not touched in years, crisp pages, neatly organized, each one a piece of a foundation that had been built long before anyone started questioning my value, and as I flipped through them, I could almost hear my husband's voice again, calm, steady, explaining things in that patient way he always had. "You should always keep copies, Margaret, just in case," he used to say, and I had smiled back then, thinking it was just his cautious nature, but now, sitting alone at my desk, I realized it had been something more, something intentional, something protective. I pulled out a document dated nearly 20 years ago, the original formation papers of the company Daniel now proudly called his own, and I traced my fingers lightly over the signatures, his name, my husband's name, and then mine smaller, but still there, still present, and for a moment I just sat there, letting that fact settle in, because somewhere along the way, that detail had been quietly erased from conversations, replaced with a narrative that was simpler, cleaner, and far more convenient for everyone else. I continued flipping through the pages, finding amendments, restructuring documents, financial summaries, all of them familiar in a distant way, like looking at an old photograph of yourself and realizing how much you had forgotten about the person you used to be. And then I found the document that made me pause completely, a shareholder agreement, updated several years after the company had started to grow. The kind of document that defines control, ownership, and decision-making power, and as I read through it carefully, line by line, I felt that same quiet clarity deepen into something more solid, more undeniable, because there it was, not hidden, not coded, but written plainly in legal language that left no room for interpretation. My name, Margaret Collins, holding a majority share, 55%. I leaned back in my chair, not shocked, not even surprised, but certain, because this was not new information. It was simply information that had been allowed to fade into the background, overshadowed by years of silence and assumption. And I thought back to the last time anyone had mentioned ownership directly. It had been after my husband passed, a brief conversation with a lawyer who had come to the house, a man named Richard Hale, who had spoken carefully, respectfully, explaining that everything was structured to protect the company and the family, and that I would remain a central figure in that structure. At the time, I had nodded, grateful but overwhelmed, because grief has a way of dulling even the most important details, and I had trusted that things would remain as they were meant to be. But now, as I sat there holding that document, I realized something else entirely. The structure had not changed, only the story around it had, and that shift had not been accidental. I closed the folder gently and reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I had not used in years, Richard Hale, and for a moment, I hesitated, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that once I made this call, things would begin to move, quietly at first, but inevitably, and I pressed dial, holding the phone to my ear as it rang, once, twice, 3 times before. His voice answered, older now, but still steady. "This is Richard Hale." And I said calmly, clearly, "Richard, this is Margaret Collins. I believe we need to review some documents." There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to recognize my name, to connect it with the past, and then his tone shifted slightly, more attentive. "Of course, Margaret, it has been a long time. How can I assist you?" And I glanced down at the folder in front of me, at the signature that still carried weight whether anyone acknowledged it or not, and I replied, "I would like to confirm my current position in the company, specifically regarding ownership and voting rights." Another pause, but this one felt different, not uncertain, but careful, professional, and then he said, "I understand. I can prepare everything for you. Would you like to come into the office?" And I shook my head slightly, even though he could not see me, because this was not something that needed an audience, not yet. "No, Richard, I would prefer you send me copies first. I would like to review them personally." And he agreed without hesitation, and as the call ended, I set the phone down beside the folder and allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, because while they had been busy deciding who I was and what I contributed, they had overlooked something fundamental, something that did not rely on opinions or perceptions, something that existed whether they acknowledged it or not, and for the first time since that dinner, I felt something shift, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, in a way that mattered far more, because I was no longer observing from the outside. I was beginning to understand the full shape of what had been taken from me, or rather, what they believed they had taken, and how easily that belief could be undone. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of stillness that usually brings comfort, but that day it felt different, sharper, like everything around me had become more defined now that I was finally paying attention, and I made my coffee the same way I always did, measuring carefully, pouring slowly, letting the familiar routine ground me while my mind moved ahead of me, already thinking through what needed to happen next. And when I sat down at the kitchen table with my cup in hand, I did not turn on the television, I did not reach for a book, I simply sat there in silence, replaying the previous night not for the emotion of it but for the details, because details are where truth hides, and I thought about Thomas, about the confidence in his voice. The way he spoke as if he understood the full picture, as if he had been given information that made him certain of his position, and that meant one thing, he had been told something, or perhaps led to believe something, and I thought about Rebecca, about how quickly she had stepped in to support that narrative without ever saying anything directly, always just enough to reinforce the idea without exposing herself, and that kind of behavior is not accidental, it is practiced, refined over time. And it only works when the people around it accept it without question, and Daniel, my son, had accepted it, whether consciously or not. He had allowed a version of reality to exist where I was no longer relevant to the very thing I had helped build, and as I sat there, I realized that this was not just about ownership on paper, it was about control of information, because if no one questioned the structure, then the structure could be quietly reinterpreted, reshaped into something more convenient for those who wanted it. And I finished my coffee and stood up, moving with purpose now, because clarity does not stay still for long. It demands action, and I walked into the small room I used as an office, the same room where I had reviewed the documents the night before, and I opened my laptop, something I had not used extensively in years, but I remembered enough, because understanding systems had once been part of my daily life, and I began searching, not randomly, but specifically, looking for public records, filings, anything that would reflect the current state of the company as it existed today, not as it had been years ago, and what I found was interesting. Not because it contradicted what I already knew, but because it confirmed something else entirely. The company had grown, expanded into new markets, new partnerships, new layers of complexity that had been added over time, but the core structure, the original ownership, had not been fundamentally altered, at least not in any way that was publicly recorded, and that told me something important. Whatever changes had been made in perception had not been fully executed in reality. And that gap, that space between what people believed and what was actually true, was where everything could shift, and as I sat there reviewing those records, I began to see the outlines of a plan that was not mine, a plan that had been forming quietly without my involvement, because certain filings suggested preparation for restructuring, for redistributing control, for consolidating authority in ways that would only make sense if the assumption was that I no longer had a role to play. And that realization did not upset me, it did not even surprise me, it simply clarified the situation further. Because if they were preparing to move forward without me, then they believed I would not stop them, and that belief was their second mistake. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, considering everything carefully, because timing matters, not just what you know, but when you choose to reveal it, and I knew that reacting too soon would only allow them to adjust, to cover, to explain things away before they were fully exposed. And I was not interested in giving them that advantage. I wanted them to continue exactly as they were, confident, certain, unaware, because people reveal the most when they believe they are unchallenged, and as I sat there, I thought about the upcoming weeks. About meetings, about conversations that would likely take place without my knowledge, and I realized that I did not need to be invited into those spaces to understand what was happening. I simply needed to be prepared when the moment arrived, and when my phone buzzed on the desk beside me, I glanced at it, seeing an email notification from Richard Hale, and I opened it slowly, reading through the attached documents he had sent. Updated copies, current confirmations, everything I had requested. And as I reviewed them, line by line, there was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. My position remained exactly as it had always been: majority owner, controlling interest, full voting authority, and I allowed myself a small breath, not of relief, but of certainty, because now there was no question left, not in my mind, not in any legal sense, and I closed the documents and sat there for a moment longer, letting the silence return, because the next step was not about discovery, it was about execution, and execution requires patience, precision, and above all, restraint. And as I stood up and turned off the light in the room, I knew that whatever they had planned, whatever assumptions they had made, they were building it on a foundation they did not fully understand, and that kind of mistake does not collapse loudly, it collapses quietly, all at once. When the truth is finally placed in front of it over the next few days, I did not call Daniel, and he did not call me either. Which in itself was not unusual anymore, but this time the silence felt different. Less like distance and more like confirmation, because when people believe they have already moved past you, they stop checking if you are still there, and I let that assumption settle. I let it breathe, because it gave me space to move without interruption, and on Tuesday morning, I dressed carefully, not for appearance but for purpose, choosing a simple navy sweater and a pair of slacks that made me feel composed, steady, and I drove across town to a building I had not entered in years. The company headquarters, the same place where I had once spent long afternoons reviewing budgets, discussing plans, making decisions alongside my husband when everything was still shared, and as I parked my car and stepped out, I took a moment to look up at the glass facade, reflecting the sky in a way that made it seem larger than it was, more important, more distant, and I wondered briefly how many decisions had been made inside without me. How many times my absence had been noted and then dismissed, and I walked through the front doors, the familiar scent of polished floors and quiet air conditioning greeting me. And the receptionist looked up, her expression polite but uncertain, as if she recognized me but could not quite place where I belonged in the current version of things, and I smiled gently and said, "Good morning, I am here to review some records," and she nodded quickly, offering a courteous response. "Of course, do you have an appointment?" And I paused just long enough to let the question hang before replying. "I will not need one." And there was something in my tone, not sharp, not forceful, but certain, that made her glance down at her screen and then back at me with a slight shift in her posture, and she said, "Let me notify Mr. Collins." And I inclined my head slightly. "You may." And I waited, standing there calmly, hands resting lightly at my sides, observing the small movements around me, employees passing by, conversations carried in low voices, the rhythm of a place that functioned efficiently because it followed a structure, and structures rely on clarity, even when the people within them do not fully understand it. And after a few minutes, I saw Daniel approaching from down the hallway, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else, something less defined, and when he reached me, he said, "Mom, I did not know you were coming." And I met his gaze steadily. "That is all right, Daniel, there are many things you do not know." And he gave a small, uncertain laugh, as if trying to interpret my tone, and then he gestured toward his office. "Why do not we talk inside?" And I followed him without hesitation, stepping into a space that was larger than I remembered, modern, carefully arranged, a reflection of growth and ambition, and he closed the door behind us, turning to face me. "Is everything okay?" he asked, and I considered that question for a moment before answering. "That depends on how you define okay." And he frowned slightly, confusion settling in. "Mom, if this is about Thanksgiving, Thomas can be, he does not always think before he speaks." And I shook my head gently. "This is not about Thomas." And that seemed to unsettle him more than if I had agreed, because it shifted the focus somewhere else, somewhere less predictable, and I walked slowly toward the desk, my eyes moving across the surface, noting the files, the neatly arranged documents, the signs of someone who believed they were in control of everything within these walls, and I said quietly, "I came because I realized I have not been here in a long time." And he nodded, still trying to understand. "Yes, you have been busy, and we have been handling things." And I turned to look at him then, really look at him, not as my son, but as the man standing in front of me making decisions that affected more than just himself, and I said, "That is exactly what concerns me." And he opened his mouth to respond, but I raised my hand slightly, not to silence him, but to pause the moment, because timing matters, and this was not yet the time to explain everything. This was the time to observe, to confirm, to allow him to reveal what he believed without interference, and I added, "I would like to review the current operational structure, the financial reports, and any recent filings." And he blinked, clearly not expecting that. "You mean, like the company records?" And I nodded. "Yes, Daniel, like the company records." And there was a brief silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to expose hesitation, and in that hesitation, I saw it, the realization that something was shifting, that the version of me he had grown accustomed to was no longer present in the way he expected, and he said, carefully, "We can arrange that, but it might take some time to gather everything." And I smiled softly, the same calm, measured expression. "Take the time you need, I am not in a hurry." And as I turned to leave the office, I added one more thing, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it would stay with him long after I was gone. "Daniel, I believe it is time we all understand exactly how things are structured." And I walked out without waiting for his response, because sometimes the most important part of a conversation is not what is said, but what is left unresolved, and as I stepped back into the hallway, I knew that whatever they had been planning, whatever assumptions they had been building, they had just encountered something they had not accounted for, and now, they would begin to adjust, and that adjustment would reveal far more than any direct question ever could. When I left the building, I did not look back, because I did not need to see their reactions to know what was already happening inside those walls. Uncertainty had been introduced, and uncertainty has a way of spreading quickly when people have been relying on assumptions instead of facts. And as I drove home, I kept my thoughts focused, not on what I had said, but on what I had not said, because restraint is what gives words their weight when they are finally used, and I knew that Daniel would not let the matter rest. He would start asking questions, reviewing documents, speaking to Rebecca, and that was exactly what I wanted, because pressure reveals truth more effectively than confrontation. And later that afternoon, as I was setting a kettle on the stove, my phone rang. And I glanced at the screen, seeing Daniel's name, and I let it ring. Once, twice, before answering, not to create tension, but to establish rhythm. "Hello, Daniel," I said, my voice steady, and there was a brief pause before he responded. "Mom, I have been looking into what you asked for." His tone measured, careful, as if he was choosing each word with intention, and I could hear something underneath it, something unsettled. "That is good," I replied simply, and he continued. "Some of the records, they are not exactly how I understood them." And I allowed a small silence to follow, giving him space to fill it, because people often reveal more when they feel the need to explain. "Rebecca has been handling most of the administrative side," he added, almost as an explanation, almost as a defense, and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me. "I am sure she has," I said, and then I added gently, "but handling something and understanding it are not always the same." And there was another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, less certain. "Mom, did you know about the ownership structure?" And I turned off the stove, letting the quiet click of the burner fill the space between his words. "I have always known what your father and I put in place," I said, not elaborating, not explaining further, because clarity does not need decoration, and he exhaled softly, the sound of someone realizing that the ground beneath them is not as stable as they believed. "I think we should sit down and talk about this," he said, and I smiled faintly, because that suggestion came exactly when I expected it to. "We will," I replied. "But not yet," and that seemed to catch him off guard. "Not yet," he repeated, and I continued calmly. There are still things that need to be reviewed properly, thoroughly. I would not want any misunderstandings. And he hesitated, clearly wanting resolution but sensing that it was not within his control at the moment. Okay, he said finally. Just let me know when you are ready. And I ended the call with a simple acknowledgement, setting the phone down on the counter and pouring myself a cup of tea, because patience is not passive, it is active, it is choosing not to act until the moment is right. And over the next 2 days, I watched as small changes began to ripple outward. I received a follow-up email from Richard Hale with additional confirmations, more detailed breakdowns of the current corporate structure, and each document reinforced the same reality. Nothing had been legally altered in the way they seemed to believe, and that discrepancy meant one thing. Someone had been operating under an assumption that had never been verified, and assumptions, when built into decisions, can become liabilities. And on Thursday morning, I received another call, this time from Rebecca, which was rare enough to be notable, and when I answered, her voice was as composed as ever. "Margaret, I hear you stopped by the office," she said, her tone light but measured, and I replied, "Yes, I felt it was time." And she paused briefly before continuing. "Daniel mentioned you had some questions about the company. I would be happy to clarify anything for you." And I let that offer sit for a moment, considering not her words but the intention behind them, because offers to clarify often come when someone wants to control the narrative. "That is kind of you," I said, "but I prefer to review things directly." And there was the slightest shift in her tone, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm what I already suspected. "Of course," she replied. "Transparency is important." And I nodded to myself, because transparency had not been their priority until now. "It is," I agreed, and then I added, "and it is most effective when it is complete." And there was a pause, longer this time, before she responded. "We should all meet, Margaret, to ensure we are aligned." And I smiled, because alignment was exactly what had been missing. "We will," I said, echoing Daniel's earlier suggestion. "Soon." And as the call ended, I placed the phone back on the counter and took a slow sip of tea, letting the warmth settle, because the situation was no longer unclear, it was unfolding exactly as it needed to. They were beginning to realize that something fundamental had been overlooked, and in that realization, their confidence would begin to shift, and when confidence shifts, so do decisions, and I intended to be present for that moment, not as someone reacting, but as someone who had been there all along, waiting for the truth to surface by Friday afternoon. Everything had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, not because anything dramatic had happened on the surface, but because the quiet certainty they had been operating under was no longer stable. And instability forces people to act, sometimes carefully, sometimes too quickly, and I knew they would choose the latter, because confidence built on assumptions rarely survives scrutiny without reaction, and that was when the message arrived, not a call this time, but an email from Rebecca. Formally written, carefully worded, requesting a meeting the following Monday morning at the office, including Daniel and Thomas, and I read it twice, not for the content, but for the tone, because tone reveals intention more clearly than words, and her tone was composed, but there was a subtle urgency beneath it, a need to bring everyone into the same room, to regain control of the narrative before it shifted further. And I replied simply, "Monday works for me. Nothing more, nothing less." Because brevity leaves less room for interpretation, and over the weekend, I did not review the documents again, I did not rehearse what I would say, because this was not about preparing a defense, it was about allowing them to present their understanding first, and then deciding how much truth to reveal, because truth, when delivered at the right moment, does not need repetition, it only needs clarity. And Monday morning arrived with a kind of stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if even the day itself understood that something was about to change, and I dressed the same way I had the previous week, simple, composed, unremarkable on the surface, because appearance can be a form of misdirection, and when I arrived at the office, I was not greeted at the front desk this time. Instead, I was directed immediately to the conference room, and that in itself told me everything I needed to know. They had already gathered, already begun discussing, already trying to align their understanding before I entered, and when I opened the door, I saw them, Daniel seated at the center of the table, Rebecca to his right, her posture straight, controlled, Thomas across from them, leaning back slightly but with a tension in his shoulders that had not been there before, and they all looked up at the same time, their expressions shifting as they registered my presence, and I stepped inside calmly, closing the door behind me before taking a seat at the end of the table, not at the center, not yet, because positioning matters, and I wanted to observe before I asserted, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to make it clear that whatever had been discussed before I arrived had not fully resolved anything, and then Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, thank you for coming," he said, his voice careful, measured, and I nodded slightly. "Of course." And Rebecca leaned forward just enough to take control of the conversation, her tone professional, almost rehearsed. "Margaret, we thought it would be helpful to sit down together and ensure that everyone has a clear understanding of the company's current structure and direction." And I listened, not interrupting, because she needed to continue, needed to reveal the full scope of what they believed, and she went on, outlining recent developments, growth projections, strategic plans, all presented in a way that positioned Daniel and herself as the primary drivers of the company's future, and Thomas added occasional comments, reinforcing points. Speaking with less confidence than before but still trying to maintain the same narrative, and I let them speak, I let them build the structure of their understanding in front of me, piece by piece, because once something is fully expressed, it cannot be denied when it is corrected, and when they finally paused, looking at me expectantly, waiting for my response, I folded my hands lightly on the table and said, "That is a comprehensive overview." And Rebecca gave a small nod, as if satisfied that the conversation was proceeding as she intended. "We believe it is important for everyone to be aligned moving forward," she added, and I met her gaze calmly. "Alignment requires accuracy," I said, and that single sentence shifted the room, subtly but unmistakably, because it introduced the possibility that what had just been presented was not entirely accurate, and Daniel glanced at Rebecca briefly before looking back at me. "What do you mean?" he asked, and I allowed a brief pause, not to create tension, but to ensure that when I spoke next, there would be no confusion. "I mean that before we discuss direction, we should confirm foundation," I replied, and I reached into my bag, not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with deliberate ease, and placed a folder on the table in front of me, the same folder I had reviewed days earlier, the same one that contained the clarity they had been missing, and I did not open it immediately. I simply rested my hand on it for a moment, looking at each of them in turn, because understanding is not just about information, it is about readiness, and in that moment, I could see it, the shift in their expressions, the realization that whatever they thought this meeting would be, it was about to become something else entirely. And I said quietly, clearly, "I think it is time we all look at what this company actually is, not what we have assumed it to be." And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was anticipatory, because they could feel it now, the weight of something they had overlooked, something that was about to be placed directly in front of them, and this time, there would be no room left for interpretation. I opened the folder slowly, not with hesitation but with precision, and the soft sound of paper shifting against paper seemed louder than it should have in that room, because silence has a way of amplifying even the smallest movements when people are waiting for something they cannot yet see, and I slid the first document across the table toward Daniel, not pushing it forcefully, just enough for it to rest within his reach, and I said, "Please take a look." And he hesitated for a fraction of a second before picking it up, his eyes scanning the page quickly at first, then slowing, his posture changing as the meaning of the words settled in, and Rebecca leaned slightly closer, her eyes following the document, her expression still composed but with a subtle tightening around the edges, the kind of control that requires effort, and Thomas shifted in his chair, leaning forward now, no longer relaxed, no longer certain, and I remained still, my hands resting calmly on the table, because once the truth is placed in front of someone, it does not need explanation. It simply needs to be read, and Daniel cleared his throat softly, as if grounding himself. This is from years ago," he said, and I nodded. Yes, it is the original shareholder agreement, and the amendments that followed. And Rebecca spoke next, her tone measured. That does not necessarily reflect the current structure, she said, carefully choosing each word, and I met her gaze evenly. Then I believe you will find the updated confirmations in the following pages. And I gestured lightly toward the rest of the folder, and Daniel flipped to the next document, then the next, each page reinforcing the same reality, each line leaving less room for reinterpretation, and the room grew quieter with every page turned, not because there was nothing to say, but because what could be said was becoming increasingly limited, and finally Daniel stopped, his hand resting on the document as if holding it in place would somehow change its meaning. 55%. He said quietly, almost to himself, and I inclined my head slightly. Yes. And Thomas let out a short breath, somewhere between disbelief and realization. That cannot be right, he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just days before, and I looked at him calmly. It is not a matter of belief, Thomas, it is a matter of record. And Rebecca straightened slightly, regaining some of her composure. Margaret, if this is accurate, then why has this not been part of our operational discussions? She asked, and there it was, the question that revealed everything, not why it existed, but why it had not been acknowledged, and I answered simply. Because no one asked? And that answer settled over the table in a way that no argument could, because it shifted responsibility away from oversight and onto assumption, and Daniel looked up at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing something he had overlooked for a long time. Mom, I did not know, he said, and I held his gaze, not unkindly, but without softening the truth. You did not look, I replied, and there was no accusation in my tone, just clarity, because this was not about blame, it was about understanding the consequences of not paying attention, and Rebecca's expression shifted again, more controlled now, more strategic. Even if this is correct, the day-to-day operations have been managed by Daniel and myself, she said, as if reclaiming ground, and I nodded. I am aware. And then I added, management and ownership are not the same. And that distinction landed exactly where it needed to, because it separated effort from authority, action from control, and Thomas leaned back in his chair again, but this time not out of confidence, more out of recalibration. So what are you saying? He asked, and I allowed a brief pause before answering, not because I did not know, but because I wanted the words to be heard without distortion. I am saying that before any further decisions are made, before any restructuring is discussed, before any assumptions continue, we must acknowledge the actual structure of this company. And I placed my hand lightly on the folder again, not to emphasize power, but to anchor the moment in something real, something documented, something that could not be dismissed, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling in fully now. This changes things? He said, and I met his gaze. It clarifies things, I replied, because change implies something new. And this was not new, it had always been there, waiting to be recognized, and Rebecca remained silent for a moment longer than before, her mind clearly working through implications, adjustments, possibilities, and when she finally spoke, her tone was different, less assured, more calculated. Then we will need to review everything carefully, she said, and I nodded once. Yes, we will. And as the silence returned to the room, it no longer felt uncertain or anticipatory, it felt resolved in a way that cannot be undone, because once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen, and as I looked at each of them, I understood something clearly. This was not the end of anything, it was the beginning of a different understanding, one where assumptions would no longer hold, and where every decision moving forward would have to be made with full awareness of a reality they had chosen to ignore. Until now no one spoke for several seconds after that, and it was not the kind of silence that comes from confusion anymore. It was the kind that settles when something undeniable has taken its place at the center of the room, and I could see it in their faces, in the way Daniel's shoulders had lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, in the way Rebecca's posture remained composed but no longer anchored in certainty, and even Thomas, who had entered every conversation with loud confidence just days before, now sat quietly, his gaze fixed somewhere between the documents and the table as if recalculating everything he thought he understood, and I did not rush to fill that silence. Because moments like this do not need words, they need space, space for the truth to settle, space for assumptions to dissolve, and after a while, Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter now, more grounded. "We should have reviewed this properly," he said, and I inclined my head slightly, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, because recognition is the first step toward correction, and Rebecca exhaled slowly, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. "There are decisions already in motion," she said carefully. "Partnership discussions, expansion plans," and I looked at her calmly. "Then it is fortunate we are having this conversation now," I replied, because timing is not about convenience, it is about necessity, and she nodded once, absorbing that, adjusting her position not outwardly, but internally, the way someone does when they understand that the structure they have been working within is no longer entirely under their control, and Thomas finally leaned forward again, but this time his voice carried a different tone, less sharp, more cautious. "So what happens now?" he asked, and I considered that question for a moment, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to be precise, because what comes next matters more than what has already been revealed, and I said, "Now we proceed with clarity." And they all looked at me, waiting, not interrupting, not challenging, because the dynamic had shifted, subtly but completely, and I continued. "Every decision moving forward will be reviewed with full understanding of ownership and authority, no assumptions, no omissions." And Daniel nodded slowly. "That makes sense," he said, and I could hear something in his voice that had not been there before, not just acceptance, but respect, the kind that comes when someone realizes they have misjudged a situation, and I did not press further, because respect cannot be forced, it can only be recognized when it appears, and Rebecca added, "We will need to revisit several agreements." Her tone now aligned with the reality in front of her rather than the one she had been operating under, and I replied, "Yes, we will." And then I reached forward and closed the folder gently, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a signal that what needed to be shown had been shown, and that the rest would be handled through process, through structure, through the systems that had always existed whether they acknowledged them or not, and I stood up from my seat, smoothing my hands lightly over the table as I did, and for a moment, all three of them watched me, not with the same casual dismissal that had been present at dinner, but with a quiet attentiveness that had replaced it, and Daniel rose as well. "Mom," he said, and I looked at him, waiting, and he paused before continuing. "I should have asked more questions," and I met his gaze steadily. "It is not too late to start," I replied, because regret is only useful when it leads to action, and Rebecca stood next, her expression composed but more measured now. "We will make sure everything is aligned going forward," she said, and I nodded once, because alignment now meant something different than it had before. It meant accuracy, not convenience, and Thomas remained seated for a moment longer, before standing as well, his usual ease replaced with something more reserved, and I turned toward the door, not in haste, not in triumph, but with the same calm I had carried from the beginning, because this was never about proving anything in the moment, it was about restoring what had been quietly overlooked, and as I reached the door, I paused briefly, not turning back fully, but just enough for my voice to carry clearly across the room. "Assumptions are easy to build," I said, "but they do not hold when the foundation is finally examined." And I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, leaving them with that thought, because some realizations need to settle without interruption, and as I walked through the building, past the same desks and quiet conversations, I felt something shift within me, not a surge of victory, not satisfaction in any obvious sense, but a quiet restoration, the kind that comes when something that was always yours is finally recognized again. And when I stepped outside into the open air, I took a slow breath, the same way I had days before, but this time the silence around me felt different. Not empty, not uncertain, but clear, and as I walked toward my car, I understood something with complete certainty. They had believed I was no longer part of the structure, no longer relevant to the decisions that shaped their future, but the truth had never changed, it had only been ignored, and now that it had been seen, everything else would follow, not because I demanded it, but because reality, once acknowledged, does not require permission to take its place.